amazed to see what good parity we have on this panel. So well done to the organizers. You know, it's usually 4 men, 1 woman. A little bit different today in all respects. So I would like to thank the European Commission for having assembled that panel and for asking me to participate very modestly in introducing the topic. And I will introduce the topic from the perspective that we have at the IMF, which has to do with tackling inequality, of course, which is a topic for the day and one for this session, but from the point of view of sovereigns actually taking their destiny in their hands by actually not counting only on other people's support, aid, assistance, but also on being able to count on themselves in order to generate revenue. So, I spoke this morning about women empowerment, and I'm not going to repeat what I said, but I mentioned issues such as, well, not issues because they are actually solutions, childcare, parental leave, inclusive finance for women, and you cannot actually discuss childcare or parental education if you don't also include the topic of domestic revenue mobilization. And I was trying to consider the actual connection between the two, because I tried to be a little bit consistent between my 2 interventions. And I was reminded of a quote by Margaret Mitchell. You know how you say that there are 2 things in life that are certain and that you cannot escape? One is taxation, the other one is death. Well, Margaret Mitchell has a better one. You know, she wrote Gone with the Wind, which is a lovely novel, but she also had lots of interesting things to say about life in general. And she said, death, taxes, and childbirth, there is never any convenient time for them. And she was right. But yet those 3 particular matters are central to our lives. And in fact, tax and the improvement of the tax system can boost development in incredible ways. From healthcare to education to security, and all of that has to do with where revenues come from, how much of it, and how you go about spending it, which touches on trust and accountability as well. So let me just for a minute try to explain to you what we at the IMF try to do in order to support the sovereigns, raise revenue, and hopefully spend it wisely. You may be familiar about the IMF as an institution that provides funding under programs, that provides surveillance and policy advice, and you might even know us from how we try to give crisis response as quickly as we can. We were amongst the first putting money in the bank at the time when the Ebola crisis hit, so that countries could actually pay doctors, nurses, and the rest of it, and how we mobilized from repurposing a pre-existing fund, which was not really intended for that, $380 million in next to no time, with a unanimous board to actually support us. But we have a 3rd mission, which is the development mission of providing capacity development to member states. And you would be surprised to know that we actually work in terms of taxation, revenue mobilization, public finance with 130 countries year on, year off. We have a membership of 189 countries, about 130 seek our support and advice every year, 130 of them. It ranges from all sorts of topics to others. And I will mention working, for instance, with the Central Bank of Kosovo to modernize its financial system, to training nearly 30,000 individuals, officials from countries, but also just non-officials, people who are interested in either public finance, debt sustainability analysis, removing subsidies, and we do that online for free. We teach these economic courses, and those that actually sign up for it and take the courses get a particular diploma that actually acknowledges that they have gone through that course. But we also do special assistance in order to help country mobilize domestic resources. And we believe that if that is done properly, it can be a very strong pillar of an economy. It can help meet critical needs, whether it's building hospitals, whether it's maintaining schools, whether it's providing roads. And as cities and towns are galvanized as a result of these investments, citizens can experience the benefits of their tax investment at work. And it can help create that virtuous cycle of improved infrastructure, better compliance, stronger growth, better jobs, young people integrated, hopefully women empowered as well. So those topics are very intimately linked. One might sound a bit more glamorous and the other a little bit more tedious, but they come together in order to respond to the same needs. For many developing countries, increased revenue is a necessary catalyst to reach the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and can be a driver of inclusive growth. That was abundantly clear to any of those who participated in the Addis Ababa summit, where we discussed the financing of the Sustainable Development Goals, and where it was clear that international aid would take everybody some way. And thank goodness the European Union is here to actually provide that support, as well as others, but where it was also equally clear that the sovereigns had to also generate revenue in order to respond to their needs. Yet, in some countries, revenue remains stagnant as the resources needed to enhance economic and civic life sit at best on the sidelines because the revenue efforts is not there, at worst, outside the country in some really funny, suspicious way. And that's where we try to come in. As I said, in 2016, we worked with more than 130 countries to improve their revenue collections. And demand from them, the membership is actually rising steadily. In 2016, 50% of the capacity development in public finance focused on revenue, administration, and tax policy. And we plan to intensify our efforts in the coming year with a concentration on developing countries. One small parenthesis in that respect. It's one thing to collect revenue and to make an effort. It's another thing equally needed to make sure that the tax system in place is such that there is transparency, that there is disclosure, and that nobody is actually facilitating what I call a race to the bottom, where everybody ends at the bottom. So, away from that, which requires automatic exchange of information, properly designed tax systems that are actually making sure that taxation is levied in the place where activity is conducted, how significant is the resource problem? Developing countries typically will raise about 10 to 20% of their GDP in revenue. What is the equivalent in the advanced economies? 40%. Is the attempt to converge to make sure that everybody's at 40%? No. But certainly we have concluded that for developing countries to walk that path towards convergence, there should be at least 15% of GDP collected in revenues. Do we have that in many countries? No, regrettably. In a country like Somalia, for instance, the revenue amounts to less than 2% of GDP. Somalia, extreme case, yes. But in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's about 6%. In Afghanistan, it's about 7%. In Myanmar, 8%. So you see, in many different situations, generally post-conflict, generally in transition, but in many other countries, the minimum threshold of 15% is far from being reached. So there is a good news, which is that we can make progress, and it can be done. Let me give you two examples. One is Senegal. In Senegal, the authorities decided to seek the IMF help and decided to launch a targeted program to help the government transform tax collection via electronic payments. It was not because everybody wanted to go digital. It's because everybody wanted to increase the revenue. And this program helped increase the tax ratio and reduce the scope for fraud. But it did not stop there. There was a massive improvement in collection. But they also decided to throw in what we called a hackathon. We did that in Dakar. The Senegalese authorities did that. And the whole point of the exercise was to harness the energy, the creativity, the best practices of anybody interested in proposing new solutions in order to improve revenue collections and revenue spending, and in order to actually set up creative ways to propose such achievement. That's one example. Second example taken somewhere else, Mongolia, where we just concluded a program with the authorities. You had roughly 430 medium-sized and large-sized companies contributing more than 50% of tax revenue. And what the authorities decided to do together with our help was to actually focus their efforts on those 430 companies, about 100 of which in the mining sector, with setting up a special tax office that was knowledgeable about the sector, that knew about the 430 companies, and that would actually accelerate the relationship, open up the transparency of the reporting, and actually improve compliance. And after that implementation, a nearly 100% on-time filing rate was achieved, which was a massive improvement relative to previous situation. So by focusing, by specializing, and by really identifying the biggest taxpayers, those that contributed most, a virtuous path was initiated that was soon followed up by others. There are many tools that we can use, depending on specific countries, including, you will be surprised, reducing tariff rates. It's not necessarily because the rate is extremely high that the revenue is going to come in spade. Sometimes reducing the rates, enlarging the base is the recipe. Second, cracking down on tax evasion. Third, incorporating value-added taxation, which is not perfectly redistributive, but which is certainly much easier to administrate. So the idea is not to collect more, but it's to collect smarter. And that goes as far as revenue collection, it goes as far as revenue spending is concerned, but that would be an entirely different and new topic that I will not go into. So let me just conclude with celebrating the spirit of collaboration that I have seen the whole day today and that I continue to see with the European authorities. All of us have come to development days with the same mindset, that willingness to learn from each other. And it was that same Margaret Mitchell that I've quoted earlier on, who said something like, the world can forgive almost anything, except those who will only mind their own business. We have to be mindful of others. If it is true in one area, it is certainly true in the area of taxation. If we want to avoid the race to the bottom, if we want to improve transparency and sharing of information, we have to mind other people's business. I hope you will do, and I know that with this panel, you're going to have a fantastic experience of sharing views. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madame Lagarde. It's really interesting hearing about the importance of developing countries being more self-sufficient, but also all of us minding each other's business, looking out for each other. It's a very important point that you made. I want to introduce everyone to our esteemed panelists. I want to start with Alve Selassie, who heads up the Africa Department for the IMF. Margaret Vestager, who is the Commissioner for Competition for the EC. She's going to talk to us a lot about tax policy as well. That's really her expertise. Richard Zukunu from Ghana. I'm from Nigeria, so we're kind of rivals, by the way. But he's going to talk to us about getting young people involved in inclusive growth. And Farah, at the end as well, who is with Oxfam. Farah, thank you so much for being with us. But before I begin asking questions to the panelists, I really want to ask my first question to all of you, because we really want to make this an interactive discussion. We want to hear your thoughts. All of you should be familiar by now with the EDD app. You can go into the app and actually vote on our very first question. Our first question to all of you is actually an interactive question. It's a multiple choice question. You can vote. And the question, if we could pull up on the screen, is, you can find this in the EDD app, what do you think is the biggest challenge? What do you think is the biggest challenge countries face in mobilizing revenue? So the answers, the possible answers that you can vote on are A, weak institutions, tax evasion, or lack of civic space. So just give us your thoughts. I'll reveal the results for that question answer, for the voting question a little bit later on. And secondly, while I'm talking and interviewing the panelists, if you guys at all have any question that pops into your mind, any burning question you want to ask any of these guys, you can type it into the EDD app as well. Press submit, and at the very end, in about 45 minutes from now, I'll pose it to the panelists. So, with that, I want to start with Farah. Madame Lagarde said a lot of inspiring things in terms of how we can all get involved in terms of making sure that developing countries become more self-sufficient. You and I were talking about this earlier. Just explain to us how specifically tax policy, how can tax policy really work to reduce inequality?
Yeah, thank you very much. What is very important to understand is that in the last couple of years, we have seen countries, developing countries, to make progress, for example, with really economic growth numbers that one here in Europe could be really jealous about that. But if you look at what impact of that has been on poverty reduction, on improvement in the lives of people, on investments in public services like education, healthcare, and so on. So you will see that it has been really very, regrettably, very, very low. And this has to do with the way that actually the wealth is distributed in the countries. And one of the ways that actually countries can, and the governments can do the distribution is through the tax. The tax is one revenue generation, what of course very well elaborated by Madame Lagarde. And I think it's very important to have that resources inside the country, not being depending on aid forever. Aid has a very important function, but it is not going to replace actually the resources mobilized in the countries. And secondly, with progressive tax systems, the governments can actually tax on the basis of wealth, incomes, really with a progressive tax system, and generate those resources needed for education, healthcare, agriculture policy, so that really the people can benefit from the wealth of the country. So that is what actually, that's the reason why Oxfam is engaged with the tax policy. We want to see a fair tax policy in the countries. So we want to see a fair tax system in the world, actually a global system, because we see a tax competition where there is a race to the bottom, as mentioned, and it is very, very concerning. We see a decrease in corporate tax rates worldwide, which actually creates really a lot of problem for developing countries. We know by estimation that the developing countries are missing about around $100 billion a year on tax income because of this actually tax havens and tax competition. So it is at the heart of the development debate. How fair and how just the tax systems are, how the tax administrations work, how professional they are, and how they are actually, the revenues are spent. And that's the whole issue actually which creates really the urgency for Oxfam to engage in this debate.
And Margaret, since this is your expertise, this is your wheelhouse, can I get you to jump in on how to make tax systems stronger?
Well, first of all, you have to be willing to use them. You have to use the tools available. Because what I've seen in my line of work is that the only thing certain is death. You can organize yourself out of taxes. It's just a question of resources. And in the Commission, we work like in 3 different ways. First of all, we use the state aid tool to look for selective advantages. Because we find here in Europe that you shouldn't hand out state subsidies to specific companies, because it's unfair competition. This is the story of the Starbucks case, the Fiat case, the Apple case. They all have to pay back taxes that they didn't pay, that they ought to pay. And we have more cases in the pipeline, also with European multinationals, to pay their taxes, where we find that, the backbone of Europe, small and medium-sized businesses, they pay their taxes, they create the jobs, they take young people in for education. And they shouldn't be faced with competitors on the other side of the streets not paying their taxes.
Mm. I think you have applause.
Yes, I like it too.
You have a fan, Margaret.
The second thing is that we legislate, of course, by the front door, because as you say, we have the race to the bottom. And we need and have now passed legislation to ensure more transparency for automatic exchange of information between tax authorities within Europe, so that as a tax authority, you don't just know, like Chapter 2 and 7 and 11 of the tax history of the company, but that you know the full history of the company in order to get it right. Because that's the point, to get it right, to have fair taxation. And then obviously we engage globally with the leadership of, among others, the OECD, to create a global tax alliance for fair taxation. And we're in the process of figuring out, well, who should we target? Who are the most obvious tax havens that enables tax planning in the most aggressive way, and therefore basically taking revenue out of countries needing it. And the very basic is the obvious. If you want to be a good citizen and a good corporate citizen, then, of course, you pay the taxes just as well as anyone else.
That's a good point. So, Abe, I want to get your perspective on this, on what Margaret said, from the developing world. Because a lot of countries, I'm from Nigeria, and the policy is to tax where it's easier to collect the revenue. For example, imports. Imports in Nigeria can actually end up doubling the price of a particular good. How do governments better figure out where to implement higher taxes? I mean, Madame Lagarde talked about perhaps at times lowering the rate and broadening the base instead. What are your thoughts on that?
Good question. So, in developing countries, I think we do have the political problem also of government's readiness and willingness to expand the tax base beyond what they're relatively comfortable with. So you gave the example of trade taxes, for example. It's generally been historically an easy tax handle for governments to rely on because goods have to come in through a limited entry point into countries. So if governments are able to control those entry points, they can get a hold of quite significant amounts of taxes. But this excessive reliance on those simple entry points also has been one of the factors which has led to very high rates on those areas. Because the business of expanding the tax base first requires a political decision to go out and tax sectors that have hitherto not been taxed. Then also technical difficulties, for example, in the corporate taxes, something which Farah mentioned earlier, that there's been a lot of companies that are able to avoid paying corporate taxes, either by shifting profits to areas where the activity doesn't take place, or through, through basically exploiting loopholes in the tax system. So doing corporate taxes, doing personal income tax can be difficult, hence the excessive focus on a limited number of tax handles. So, the IMF, as we do a lot of work with developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, on how to, in the first instance, to look at all of the tax policy handles that you have to see if they're optimally configured. And then, of course, a lot of technical advice also on how to better collect taxes, which I can go into a little later.
And then, Richard, I'd love to have you involved in the conversation because he's our young leader from Ghana. So you're going to talk to us during this discussion, I hope, about how young people can get involved. But since you're from Ghana and you can give us a more specific example, even as we all talk about ways to raise the tax revenue, it's really important that the government spends the money appropriately. How do they do that? I mean, and you can use Ghana as a specific example. if Ghana was to raise its tax revenue right now, what are the key areas you think your country should be investing in terms of public infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you very much. Like Madam Christina mentioned, you don't only collect more, but you widen the collection, and maybe I'll add, then you spend wisely. And I think when it comes to Ghana and some African countries, maybe that is one of the issues, how to spend resources that you mobilize domestically in a very wise way so that it goes to your areas of priority. And that is one of the things that, as a young person in Ghana, I see that maybe government don't really prioritize in terms of spending domestic resources appropriately. Because we have issues of course, corruption we talk about all the time. But for me, it's more about infrastructure in terms of health and education. Because there is that mother in the community, and all she wants is to be able to put her child to school or to be able to just go to the hospital. First of all, she's not earning enough income. So if health service is free, then she's able to access, or she can go at a subsidized price. Again, if education is also free or at a subsidized price, then she can afford that. So education, health are the two main areas I feel tax or domestic resources should go into. However, that is not the case that we see often because, of course, the MDGs came. There was a lot of euphoria around it. But domestically, we raised resources. International development partners also sent money in. But at the end, do we see that the community person has benefited, the mother, that young person? And so that's my area of concern. And so I believe government should spend more in education and also on health. And we hear about issues of corruption, and for me as a young Ghanaian, sometimes some of the things I hear is very disheartening. Because I feel that young people, we talk about demographic dividend, and there should be a lot of investment going into young people at this stage of our lives. But I could give one example, where in my country recently there was news about one of our biggest hospitals. There was a lack of access to water in that hospital. And you can imagine when we don't have water in a hospital, what happens? But in that same period, we had the board of directors of this hospital thinking about buying vehicles. And so we look at the misplaced priority here. And that is why I think there is a problem. And I was happy when our African leaders were making more commitment because it gives young people hope. But there are resources that I feel that when we just commit them to what they have been specifically targeted for, we will achieve results. I'm in a country where there is a project, a school constructed by the IMF or World Bank with World Bank funding, and the cost of that project compared to the same government, a 6-unit classroom block by the World Bank and a 6-unit classroom block by my government. And you see the difference in prices. But same building material, same structure. The World Bank funding, there was proper monitoring, there was proper mechanisms, and so the cost came very efficient. The same government building, and there's inflated prices. So we are mobilizing resources domestically, but what are the accountability mechanisms? So for us young people, we care about taxes, we care about all the technical issues. But when we wake up in the morning, we want to be able to take our bags, walk to that school. There is chalk, there is the board, there are textbooks, there is access to water, and if it's for girls, when they get to the school, there is proper sanitation so that they don't stay out of school because of lack of basic infrastructure. So when we take taxes, these are the areas we should focus on. And when we do these basic things for young people, they can access education, they can plan well for their families, and they can come at EDD, sit here and talk, just like I've also benefited from education.
Can we just give him a round of applause? Oh my goodness. That was well said, Richard. So education, healthcare. So Farah, can I just get you to pick up on that? I mean, if we are trying to raise tax revenue, how do we make sure that the money is spent appropriately and most importantly, actually trickles down to those who need it?
That's also really very, very important part of the conversation, that tax is not a kind of technical debate on how to really increase the revenue for the government. It's not only a technical discussion. It is at the heart of a political debate and the political choices that the governments do. That's true for countries here in Europe, and it's true in developing countries and everywhere else. And I think it's very important that we acknowledge the space. That was one of the 3 choices that the people that you offered to the audience, that the existence of civic space for the people to engage with their governments, to understand where the money comes from and where the money is spent on, is very, very important, very key. For example, the engagement of civil society organizations, parliaments, the national audit officers is very key to get really engagement of the people, that the people understand why to pay the taxes. I mean, we talk about taxes as if it is very something that we get happy about paying it. But normally, nobody is happy by paying taxes. I mean, just be honest about that. However, if you see what is the result and what you get back for that, then you accept that. And that's actually the basis for the social contract between the citizens and the governments. That's the reason why we actually accept the legitimacy of the government. We give them, you know, this possibility through taxes, revenue, but we expect something in return.
Right, but Farah, aren't you only going to be happy about paying taxes if you know that the money is being spent efficiently? And I'll get you to jump in on that, Ave. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Farah made a very important point. I think there is a technical part of how to collect taxes from the government, how to configure revenue offices, what kind of taxes to have. But then, of course, there's willingness to pay by people and government's ability to enforce that. So the people's willingness to pay taxes are very much related to if they see value for money for the taxes that they're paying.
Because that contract you talked about between the government and its people, the contract is a lot weaker in the developing world because you don't feel as though, I mean, Richard, you know, I'm guessing you might agree with this, you don't feel as though the money is going to be spent efficiently.
I think there's a number of things that governments can do. I mean, first of all, we have to be careful in terms of how we generalize.
Yeah, of course.
The situation varies tremendously. And I think, you know, most sub-Saharan African countries, for example, collect 16, 17 percentage points of GDP and tax revenues, which is good. I mean, they can do more, but, you know, many countries that collect a reasonable amount given their per capita income level. But of course, as the managing director noted, there's also quite a lot of countries, including some who know better or should be doing better, like Nigeria, that are only collecting, you know, 6-7 percentage points of GDP in taxes. So the situation varies. But one thing I wanted to stress is, and which would go towards strengthening the contract, the social contract, is transparency. I think our governments can do a lot more in terms of being more transparent about what money is being used for. And I think there, perhaps that's one agenda on the government side. Another aspect of transparency and in tax collection also, I think in terms of what money is being used for, and something which would bring a bit more pressure to both companies and the government is, for example, tax. We see a lot of potential to revenue being lost through exemptions, tax exemptions that are provided to companies in particular. Typically, these companies are either foreign companies, or if they're domestic companies, you know, companies that are very prominent in the city, they tend to get quite a lot of tax exemptions. Bringing transparency about how much that actually costs the budget would be another step forward in terms of you know, putting political pressure into reducing those exemptions and providing a bit more money into the government kitty.
So, Margaret, how can governments be much more transparent when it comes to tax policy?
Well, if I was to vote on the question that you posed initially, my answer would be institutions. Because if you want transparency, then you need institutions who feel that they can master it. And a lot of these things are relatively tricky, especially when it comes to corporate taxation. And I think we should be so ambitious, not just, as you say, to tax the obvious, this individual citizen, imports coming in, because it's the corporation who should contribute to countries where they generate their profits. And as far as I know, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, they estimate that the corporate tax avoidance has a value of $50 billion. That is 3 times the European Commission, European institution, development aid contribution. 3 times, just because of corporate tax avoidance. So I think you need strong institutions to do sometimes very complicated work and to be transparent about it, so that companies know that it's not just me who are targeted, it's everyone who pays their fair share here. And I think that we can do a lot in enabling countries to partner up to say, well, we like the way you do your taxation, we like your institutions, could we partner up in order to learn more, to figure out how to do this? And I know it's not very visible, and it's not a school or a hospital, but it's the foundation for a school and a hospital and equal opportunities that you have a tax system that actually works. And I come from a small country, Denmark, and if you ask people, you'd find a number of people who are quite happy to pay their taxes. And they're quite high. You know, it can be like 50% of your income. But the flip side of that is that you have universal education, you have lifelong education, you have universal healthcare, and you have universal retirement systems. So you see the benefits. And on top of that, you have a social network that sort of makes it one of the most equal countries in the world. So it is doable. The problem is, of course, getting there. And in getting there, I think you need to build up institutions. And I think we can inspire and partner up in doing that.
So building institutions is one thing. You know, trying to curb tax avoidance, that's obviously very important. But Farah, you and I were talking earlier, and I think Abe and I were talking on the phone about this, is that yes, you can try to curb tax avoidance, but also a lot of developing countries will offer massive corporations huge tax incentives to come on and, you know, invest in our country. Does that help or hurt when it comes to actually increasing the tax revenue?
Honestly, from the research and a lot of evidence, what we know, and I'm sure that Abe can speak to that even more in detail, is that all those tax incentives really are not needed to attract investors in the countries. The investors are going anyway to invest in those countries. That's actually what is really shown after a lot of research. So that harms. So let's be clear, that's harmful. It is harmful to give those tax incentives because what you get back is really very limited if you compare with what you are losing. That's the first thing. And the second thing is what I actually already mentioned, that there is no transparency about it. So the people really in the countries, they don't know what's going on, what is happening, and what is the real cost that they are paying for having these, investments in the country.
Abe, would you agree?
I definitely, I strongly agree on the point on the absence of transparency. And in a way, in terms of building a political consensus to reducing the level of exemptions, I think showing how much the exemptions governments are providing are costing, or potentially costing, would be one of the ways to bring political pressure to containing the size of the. Let me come to that. Do they, so I think governments often are in a bind. I mean, they don't have full information, and companies come and say, "Look, I'm ready to do this big investment unless you give me tax incentive." I think what we know is that by and large they don't work. Maybe there are some specific incentives or circumstances in which a tax incentive may be necessary or may incentivize an investment to take place. But by and large, most tax incentives I don't think have the payoff that governments expect them to have. So we feel kind of as a general rule that they should be very limited. They certainly are in most countries costing a lot of revenues, and should definitely be narrowed as much as possible. One thing I, again, would want to come back to is, there is a political challenge. I think we see this even in Europe. And what we need to do in many African countries is really to show how much these tax incentives are costing. And I think that would, bringing transparency to it. At a minimum, parliaments should be aware how much money is being lost for these tax incentives. And having an open debate is also, I think, very important about this.
Right, so both of you actually believe, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Margaret, that even without these incentives, these massive incentives that the Nigerian government, for example, offers, that these conglomerates, these multinational companies would invest in these countries anyway. I mean, that's huge. I mean, Margaret, would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, and actually, my point about institutions is part of that. Because if you have strong institutions that you can rely on, then you create also an investment environment that's reliable, so that you can actually make sure that if I invest, I get my return over the years. Because, Here you find peace and quiet and reliable institutions, so I know what to expect. So the building up of institutions also is a thing that attracts investment. And I completely agree that subsidies, no matter the form they come in, it can be money in your hand, it can be a free piece of land to build, it can be a tax incentive. Well, they are damaging also because you will have national businesses who do not get the same subsidy, the same free piece of land, the same tax subsidies, and they have to compete for the same capital, for the same skilled employees, and they, of course, are then at a disadvantage. And you want also your domestic businesses to have a fair chance of making it in the market.
To be fairer. Farah, let me just get Richard's thoughts, because, Richard, we've been talking a lot about tax policy, and that is something that definitely needs to be worked on, but it's also about tax administration, and that means the actual ability of the government to actually go out and collect taxes. I think we can all agree that, obviously, import taxes, it's a lot easier. VAT is probably a lot easier than actually collecting income taxes on everyday individuals. What are some of the challenges that the Ghanaian government has when it comes to collecting taxes for individuals?
I think for that, I would say we have more of the informal sector in Ghana, and so you realize that the tax is it's more focused on those in the formal working sector. And when you have the informal sector, that also contributes or makes income a lot, but you don't have a way of collecting tax from them, then that's also a problem. So ways of finding innovative ways of making sure that the informal sector also contributes to tax. Because the informal sector, for instance, in Ghana, in terms of those who deal in spare parts, those who deal in petty trades, they actually also make a lot of income. Because, we know our mothers who trade, those who go and bring goods from outside, most of them are also earning a lot of income. So how do they contribute? And most of them, for the lack of education, feel that escaping tax, not paying tax, they don't feel any responsibility towards paying tax to the state, because they feel they have escaped tax and it's something they should be proud about. So what is the education system to understand why you should pay tax? But of course, if I see how government is spending already the very little it is collecting, whether effectively or wisely, then am I motivated, no matter the amount of education going on, to encourage the informal sector to pay tax? Are they motivated to pay because they've seen that the little that we have paid, we are seeing more schools? The little that they have paid, we are seeing hospitals. So I go to this hospital and I'm told that because tax has improved, government has subsidized hospital bills. Then I know when I pay my tax, this is what it's going in for. If not, people don't pay and they feel happy about it. So what is the core responsibility of a citizen? We want to hold our government accountable, but as a citizen, we have responsibilities. So if you don't perform your responsibility, then it's very difficult. But do we understand that responsibility as citizens? And that is where, like you mentioned, weak institutions. And in my country, when you mentioned the issue of the National Commission for Civic Education, from my primary school to high school to my university, they've always talked about lack of funds, lack of funds, lack of funds. It's only when it's election and then they make a few posters about how to vote, where to put your thumbprint, or when it's about, you hardly see them coming out because it's always about lack of funds. So if government do not strengthen these institutions, which will in the end make citizens understand their responsibilities, then we have a problem here. So strong institutions is an issue, and I know that when we continue to build upon them, we will achieve results, especially for young people growing up. What we see is likely what we will grow up to also come and follow. So if the system is not put in place now, we will also grow up with the same attitude of evading tax and not feeling even bad about it. So we should have the institutions in place. Civic education should work. It should go to our primary schools, high schools. As we are growing up, there are values that we learn. And in Europe or some other places, it's values. When your values are strong, then you commit to what you have to do. But if my education or my upbringing does not make me see anything wrong with not paying taxes, anything wrong with being corrupt, anything wrong with spending money that is supposed to be meant for community development, then there is also a problem there. So civic education should be strong and geared towards also changing the mindset of people. And lastly, maybe I'll add, I had the opportunity to have an exchange program in Finland for 6 months, which was financed by the Finnish government. And when I got there, the mindset of the people how they react to situations, the values. And these were things that were very new to me because that was a very new system to me altogether. And I saw how if individuals share the same values and are committed, we can all make a change. And so those are some of the things I learned. And I had the opportunity of interviewing that former Prime Minister Alexander Stubbs when I was there. And there was one thing he mentioned that always resonated in my mind, that young people like you are not being, we are supporting you because we want you to go back to your community and make change. That is why we give you scholarship packages to come here. So I believe that if that same mindset that I have believed in, I have seen, and I have imbibed in me, we grow up with that mindset, then if we share the same values, we will just commit to our responsibilities, knowing that we are citizens and we have to do that.
Can I?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Just to elaborate a little on that point, because I think it is important that we do not just focus on children and young people, because it's my generation and older who are responsible for the mess that we're in. And since we are also the parents, and as you say, you look at your parents, you look at the adults, you copy their behavior. If they don't pay taxes, why should I? Because this is the way to do. Children want to look like their parents. So we should never give up on adults. We should provoke a change in behavior in adults in order to be better, to raise the next generation and invite another kind of citizenship. Because otherwise we'd never change. Because the children wants to copy their parents, which is a good thing, if the parents are doing the right thing.
Yeah. So you start gradually with the current generation.
Yes.
So are they, we've heard Richard talk about the responsibility of the individual to actually want to pay taxes and changing the mindset. But what about the actual government policy to make tax administration more effective, especially when it comes to raising money from individual income taxes?
So, to be fair, the situation varies from country to country. So what we do typically when we have one of our capacity technical assistance missions that go into a country is to look at the lay of the land. So in some, we look both at the policy. First of all, we look at what potential taxes a country can raise, and then we break that down into and then what is the actual. So often there is a gap of 3, 4, 5 percentage points of GDP is not uncommon. Some of it will be explained by policies. So there are areas which the government doesn't tax. The point you made earlier about those countries that focus too narrowly on trade taxes. Others have too much exemptions. So we identify what is being caused by policy. And then another part, of course, is sometimes attributable to institutions, tax collection institutions not being strong enough. So some countries have really, really dated registry of taxes, of the companies that are paying taxes. So you have to update the registry to reflect all of the enterprises that are active now. So we break this down into the policy element. We recommend suggestions on policy reforms that can be done. And then, of course, institutional improvements at the tax level. I have to say, more often than not, the latter part, the tax administration changes are a bit more of a technical nature and are doable. And we often struggle on the more policy side because that's where both political will is required by the government to tackle companies that vested interests that often are that do not want to pay as much taxes. And of course, there's the compliance angle also. So bringing about transparency as to what the money is being used to is again a very important element of getting buy-in and making people ready to pay in a compliant fashion. Modern tax systems are very strongly reliant on people being willing to pay. So building the case for paying also is going to be very important.
I do want to touch on something that is as important as collecting more revenue, and that is countries focusing on their sustainable development goals. So Farah, I want to bring you in. What would you say the link is between better domestic resource mobilization and a country working towards achieving its sustainable development goals?
Sustainable development goals are very ambitious goals. I mean, we know what is actually target, what we are aiming for, we want to see no hunger anymore. We want to see less inequality. We want to see access to education for everyone. So that's really kind of very, very ambitious target and goals that we set as international community together. And we did it in 2015. And we are already actually 2 years after those targets. And if you look at where we are, we have already now to be very concerned about whether we are going to make it or not, so in 2030. For realizing those goals, actually are trillions of dollars and euros needed to be able to deliver on those promises to the public, to the people. So aid will be important for some countries still, we know that. So in that sense, it is important that some countries and European Commission and others really remain committed to their promises. But it is not enough. It's not going to be enough. And therefore is really this domestic resources are very, very needed, very much needed. And if you allow me, I would like actually to go back to what also Margaret was saying with the example of Denmark. And you made a very, very important remark by saying Denmark is also one of the less unequal countries in the world. So if we want really inclusive growth, we want less inequality. So then the governments need the means in really progressive policies to be able to do that redistribution of wealth. Otherwise, we will see economic growth, yes, but we will see at the same time increased gap between the poor and rich. And that will be far away from realizing of SDGs. So it is very important to keep in mind how we are actually getting our resources together. Why is it possible in this world that 8 men in the world are able to have the same wealth as the rest, as the half of the population? How is this possible? How is it possible that we accept that? And that is actually, I think, the question, the really important question to put here, and understand how big the task is. So therefore, going back, it is not only a technical issue, it is political will needed, and political will, we know it also from here in Europe, is not going to come just from governments. We need civil society, we need pressure from people, so that the governments really change those policies and understand that equality is important to get in actually inclusive growth and to be in a place in a world that everybody benefits from development. That is really at the heart of the discussion and debate.
So then, Richard, you know, in terms of ways to, I mean, Farah just gave a very passionate speech about reducing inequality, she made a very important point about the small number of people in this world who control the majority of the wealth in the world. Aside from better tax policies, Richard, aside from aid, what would you say were some of the other ways that governments can fight to tackle inequality, particularly in Ghana?
Yeah, I think one of the key ways to tackle the issue of inequality, first of all, of course, redistribution of resources to enable that families are earning good income and to be able to take care of their kids and give them quality education, quality healthcare. But also particularly to tackle this, like he mentioned, the issue of civil society organizations. Because there are a lot of things there are a lot of problems in this world, there are a lot of problems in my country, and I believe no matter how passionate my president is or no matter how committed my minister is, he cannot see what is happening in every part of the country. Mm-hmm. And there are civil society organizations who want to partner with governments to implement policies, to support societies, to bring some growth. So how are we giving more space to civil society organizations? So it's one of the key ways that we can begin to tackle the issue of inequality. Because civil societies could help they could promote accountability mechanisms, and they can support government with innovative ideas as well. So it's more about opening up the space for civil society, particularly with the mention of the Busan Declaration, which commits one of the accountability frameworks. One of the indicators is about expanding the space for civil society, which leaders have committed to. So if you are willing to mobilize resources domestically, if you are willing to accept financial aid, then be willing to open the space to accept some support from civil society organizations, because they bring out reports, they educate your citizens, and you also better develop. When the issue of political will, when I hear political will, it's very important. But who is giving the will to these politicians? When citizens amass, we have a small political class, and we have the large citizens. When citizens decide, why can't the political will be there? When citizens decide that let this be done, why would politicians say no? Because they form the masses and they vote for you. So empowering citizens with information, making sure that they understand what is going on. If some of these technical debates we are having here, if the ordinary citizen begin to know how much is being lost through corruption, how much is being lost because of mismanagement, I know they are going to really get annoyed, especially the farmer in the village who has been going every day and is exporting products but is not getting the benefit. Maybe he does not understand all of these technicalities. So we need to begin to empower citizens with information. And again, civil society plays a major role. And that is the area where my work is also coming. We go into communities, we educate young people and citizens in general. We try to explain to them government budgets, particularly district assemblies, policies. Maybe we try to investigate, find out this local government said by the end of this year, we'll put a 6-unit classroom block, we'll put a health facility. We try to educate the community. This is what your district assembly has promised, and this is the budget they have to it. Now, at the end of the year, we try and engage them again, especially during elections, because this is where they decide. Have these projects been done? Did they meet your satisfaction? You empower them, and when they are going to vote, they decide. So we need to empower citizens, and when we empower them, that political will, I'm not sure anyone can continue holding it.
You get a round of applause literally for every answer. Before I get your take, Abe, I just want to remind everyone, we are, of course, taking questions from the audience. Just go into the EDD app on your cell phone, and you can type up a question. And I hope all of you have voted on the question I mentioned earlier, which is, what do you think the biggest challenge countries face in mobilizing revenue? You can vote on that question. You can type up another question, and I'll pose the question to the panelists in just a moment. But first, before we get to that, I want to get your take on what Richard just said.
I just wanted to weigh in on inclusion. You know, one thing, Sub-Saharan Africa, most countries in Sub-Saharan Africa have been enjoying a period of relatively high growth. So this whole discussion about Africa rising over the last 10, 15 years reflects a big increase in growth rates across countries. A couple of years ago, some colleagues of mine decided to look to see if this growth has been equally distributed, or, you know, if it's just been about growth and rather than inclusion. And what we found is a mixed picture, as tends to happen in Sub-Saharan Africa, where there's tremendous heterogeneity, you know, a lot of differences from country to country. And what we in general found was in countries with very diversified economic structures, the likes of Uganda, for example, growth has been accompanied by, you know, the benefits of growth have accrued to all sections of society. So we used household surveys to look at this, and, you know, by and large, you have income levels of, you know, both the richest decile and lower quintile going up about the same level. But in some countries, and Mozambique comes to mind, where growth has been much more driven by the natural resource sector. They have a lot of mining, coal, alumina exports. What we saw was a very skewed distribution, where the benefits of growth, despite Mozambique having grown by about 8% for many years, haven't accrued as much to the you know, lowest quintiles. So I think, you know, the policy interventions have to focus on, so in a country like Mozambique, I think it's going to be very important to look at the social safety nets that they have, or even why is it that the benefits of growth are just accruing to richer societies. So a tax system could be one of the ways to address it, but also outright cash transfers and other policy tools have to be looked at. You know, in a place like Uganda, of course, you want to sustain this diverse structure which has benefited all members of society. So I just wanted to make in that it's important to drill in and look at country by country how the benefits of growth are accruing, and then design policies targeting to make sure that growth is more inclusive. There is no doubt, and we've done a lot of work at the IMF to show that, you know, more inclusive growth is more sustainable growth politically, of course, but also that, you know, countries which have more inclusive growth patterns tend to sustain growth much longer, even leaving aside the political side. So the importance of making sure that the benefits of growth accrue to everybody is just, you know, first order priority.
And on that note, I want to see the results of our voting question, if we can pull that up. And I cannot see without my glasses. So everybody says most people, excuse me, say weak institutions. What are your thoughts on that, Margaret?
Well, I agree.
Yeah, because you mentioned that earlier. That's why I wanted to get your take on it.
No, but the thing is that if you have sufficiently strong institutions, then I think you can also harness globalization and make it work for all. Because the thing is, one thing is to distribute money. The other thing is to distribute opportunities. The opportunities coming from globalization. Education, the most obvious opportunity to give high quality education for everyone. For me, I think it is, if you can give it for free, well, then you can do something that is truly balancing the fact that some can do business and others can, you know, get a fair chance of making it themselves. Health is another obvious way of distributing opportunities. Not to die giving birth, for your children to survive, to go through ordinary diseases without fear of dying from them, containing epidemics. And therefore, building up and thereby also empowering people, I think we sort of can take this enormous task and put it into doable bits. Because that, I think, is always the risk in discussions like that. We get, as you, of course, provoked by the global distribution, but we have to find ways to act. And if you want to act, you have to bring things down in doable bits. And it's a doable thing to build a tax system and have a trustworthy, transparent institution. And then for civil society, of course, to do the follow-up to see if money are then spent in a way that distributes opportunity. And I think with the leadership that we see these days, states coming in to give them the IMF a mandate. In the OECD, they have a very strong mandate. We try to do our bit in the European institutions to give leadership another direction with the Sustainable Development Goals, and then following it up day by day with concrete actions. Because that, I think, is the point that what makes you tired if it's all talk and never walking. And that, I think, could be a very important change this year. That now we see the change. In Europe, we see new legislation being implemented, making it much more difficult to do aggressive tax planning. And we learn from that, and we would be more than happy to partner up with countries around the world who want to build institutions that can do exactly the thing of transparency and enabling civil society to do the control of the spending actually being done in a proper way.
And it would be a really helpful support system as well to have that partnership. Okay, guys, now it's time for the questions from the audience. Let's see what they have in store for you. This is really high tech. Okay. This is for Richard. Someone in the audience posed this question for Richard. If you could speak to other young citizens from your country, what would you say to mobilize them to do something on an issue which is perceived as being too technical by most people?
If I had a chance to speak to other young people, 15 years from now, definitely there will be a meeting to evaluate how far we've come with the SDGs. And I should be in my 40s or 30s by then. But you ask, will the young people, will we be proud of that 15 years, because we will be living it. And so if we look at what is going on in our countries now, and we do not take action, then in 15 years' time, we will be living the consequence of whatever we could not do today. So as a young person, taking action, holding your government accountable through civic means is not an option, because you will be living whatever you did not take action for. And so I will encourage every young person in my country to take up their civic role. You have the right to petition government. You have the right to peacefully demonstrate. You have the right to vote. Make those critical decisions now and use this civic means to hold your government accountable. Because 15 years from now, whatever you were not able to do, the consequence, if it's good, we will live it and be happy. If it's bad, we will also be in it.
That's right. Growing up, my mother always said to me, life is either you pay now or you pay later, and if you pay later, it will be with interest. That's how she got me to study. Anyway. Okay, so this is a question from Hannah, and this is for Abe from the IMF. We know that European and other countries' tax policies affect other countries' tax revenues, also in the South. How can we effectively assess and mitigate the impact?
A couple of things here. I think first and foremost, a lot of the work that's going on under the rubric of international communities good at, bureaucrats are good at coming up with acronyms, and one is BEPS, which is base erosion and profit shifting. So you have quite a few African countries losing taxes to companies that are based and doing a lot of work in Africa, but actually being taxed sometimes in low-income, lower tax districts, jurisdictions in Europe, including. So any work that's going on that's right now under the OECD's aegis to make sure that taxation falls or taxes are paid in the areas where economic activity takes place, the work that's being done there would be beneficial to sub-Saharan African countries. But I would say, kind of in terms of closing this gap, you know, many African countries we estimate have a gap of between 3 and 5 percentage points of GDP in additional tax revenues that have to be mobilized. Much of that, I think, has to come from domestic policies. As I noted earlier, looking at tax exemptions, doing policies to expand tax bases, to go out and tax untaxed firms. In many countries, we noted earlier that there's been a lot of economic growth, but the companies that are generating this growth are not in the tax register. So expanding those tax registers, that kind of technical work, which requires a lot of political will, is what's needed.
Hannah, I hope that answered your question sufficiently wherever you are. And Joanna, let me know how much we have in terms of time. Okay. So this is a question from Jose, and I'll pose it to you because it also includes you as well. So if the issue, this is Farah, I'm sorry I didn't say your name. If the issue is about civic participation, how can one foster local population engagement and ownership to demand more government accountability when they feel so far away from government institutions and see no added value to the role the state can play in their daily livelihoods? Don't we need more civic space?
That's actually absolutely correct. I mean, I totally agree with this statement, even it is posed as a question, because that's really the challenge. How we increase the legitimacy of the governments, and so that the people see them as their governments, serving their interests, not a kind of political elite or, you know, an elite which is serving its own interests. And therefore, we need all really means that we have as civil society to engage with the institutions. Yes, the institutions are very key, very important. But before the institutions can be really legitimate and have this power also to pose good policy, they need the support of people. People have to understand, to engage with these institutions. And that's the reason why, for example, for Oxfam, this engagement is so key. We have developed a program, a global program, which is called fiscal accountability for inequality reduction, and that works actually in more than 20 countries. And that is exactly the aim of the program in those 20 countries. First of all, to engage with tax policy and to get really this progressive tax policy. But secondly, to engage through the work that organizations like Richard's organization do in holding the governments accountable, but not the government sitting in there only in the capital, but really in your local community. Engage with it, ask questions. I have been in Mali with a group of women and men, most of them not even able to read and write, but at the same time, through this civic engagement and civil engagement, understanding the budgeting process, understanding how money comes in and how much money comes in and how much is going to different, different places, and also to raise the voice, because understanding is the one, and the next step is, to demand. To raise, to demand, and to say, yeah, but I mean, that's not the right way, and I want to see it actually distributed differently. And I think this is the kind of engagement that we need from people, because this is not in nobody's interest if there is no trust relationship between the governments and people. It is nobody's interest.
I also have a great question for you, Margaret. And I wish the person had written their name so I could mention them, but it's a great question. So the question is, how can developing countries mobilize more resources when some EU member states are granting tax advantages and breaching competition law? Shouldn't the EU be leading by example?
Definitely.
Great question.
Definitely. And we're trying to do so step by step. We try to tackle sort of the individual selective advantages that individual businesses get from member states, because this is unfair competition to give state aid to one company and the rest of the companies have to pay their taxes. We changed legislation in order for tax authorities to exchange information, to have more transparency. We work right now on a common corporate tax base to disable part of the tax planning and to enable simpler taxation for smaller businesses that may only be active in 2 or 3 or 4 member states. And one of the things that we work on trying to exactly lead by example is to have public country-by-country reporting. Because as civil society, you really want to know what kind of business a business is doing. Number of employees, activities, turnover, profits, and taxes paid. Because if it then turns out that they have no employees, but quite a lot of turnover in the country, then you may want to ask follow-up questions. And I think that kind of transparency, where you also enable media, well, that is a great incentive for authorities to work together and for politicians to do the right thing. We saw that with the LuxLeaks, the Panama paper, when journalists work through things, make it accessible, understandable, at the same time, so we get also not only a European, but a global awareness of these problems. Then we can change things. And the good news is that it is happening as we speak. Too slow for most of us, but it is happening.
But it is getting better.
Yes.
Okay, guys, listen, I've been told that time is up, sadly, but can we give our panelists a round of applause, please? And now I would like to welcome to the stage the Vice President of the Ivory Coast, Daniel Duncan, who's going to add to the conversation and give closing remarks.
Mrs. Lagarde mentioned that there is a balance on the panel, 2 women and 2 men. I've noticed also that they have spoken in English. So maybe I should make my closing remark in French to make the equilibrium. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure for me to be here this afternoon. I think you're quite right. We are here to, I think we should applaud the moderator, but also the panel, because we've had an excellent debate here this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen on the panel, participants, ladies and gentlemen, during this very rich debate on mobilizing internal domestic resources to make sure we have inclusive growth and support equality, I'd like to thank all the participants for the excellent contributions they've made for us to look in depth at this very important question. But I'd like to pick up on a couple of points which I think are essential. Africa is going through structural changes at the moment to become more inclusive, but we need to put our foot on the gas pedal. We have to make sure that our economies become more attractive so that we can provide more jobs and make sure that we can have the emergence of a stronger middle class. We need structural change to make sure that our economies become more competitive. We also need to state that the financing of these reforms and financing for infrastructure has to be sustainable. That's why the question has to be put: how can we achieve this structural change in a stable macroeconomic situation? In Côte d'Ivoire, 20% of internal resources have to cover 80% of the budget, but only 20% is from tax, and other 20% comes from other sources. Now, 15% of domestic resources come from taxation. So in order to improve the coverage rate, taxation rate, we have to use three pillars, levers: taxation, but also we have to mobilize national savings and also promote private public partnerships. Now, with regards to tax and taxation, we've talked for a long time about reforming this to make the economy more competitive, to increase receipts from taxation. Now, there's a large informal part of the economy, but also we have to make sure that we increase taxation from the exploitation of natural resources in our country. And all this has to be done by applying multilateral, multinational cooperation. It's not something we can do just at home, but we have to do this internationally. Now, with regards to increasing the domestic resources, we have to increase our tax take from 20% to up to 40%, which you have in Asian countries now. We have to make sure that we increase the use of new technologies in our country, for example, mobile banking, electronic banking, for example. We have to make sure that we have structural funds in place so that the fair share of the revenues from the exploitation of natural resources in our country actually get into the exchequer. Now, with regards to private-public partnerships, PPPs, we must make sure that we have a measure in place, a legal framework in place, which allows the public authorities to be able to attract private foreign inward investment. I'm very glad to see that a lot of progress has been made via the World Bank, which will allow for an increase in private investment in our country via guarantees and bonification. When we met the Commissioner, he said that the EU was going to be put a similar situation in place to make sure that private investment was guaranteed and protected. We have to make sure that we have all the necessary reforms in place and the legal framework in place so that the reforms can occur, so that jobs can be created, particularly for young people. And this has to be also achieved via entrepreneurial training for young people to ensure that a large number of people can escape from poverty. Poverty is a handicap for individuals, but also for the country. Therefore, various national plans are being put into place in Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, multi-annual plans put in place to make sure that we can increase revenue so that we can increase our actions in order to provide better education, to provide more jobs. And we've had compulsory education in our country since 2015 for children from the age of 6 to 16. It's the state that's financing this. And where health is concerned, we have put in place now, since 2017, what we call a universal health coverage, universal health insurance coverage. But it only covers 15% of the population. We hope that by 2025, with the new system, 90% of the population will be covered by health coverage and will have access to health. I'd like to thank the panelists for having raised these very important points. $4 billion.
Voilà. Je suis donc.
Our panelists have, I think, helped us to find serious proposals and solutions to the very difficult problems that we are facing. I'd like to thank you very much indeed for having listened to me. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Duncan. So we've learned today that domestic resource mobilization is really all about strengthening our institutions, about holding power to account, about making sure that the wealth trickles down to the poorest members of society, and of course implementing the right policies. And I would add to that it's not just about words, it's about taking action, and as Madame Lagarde said, not minding your own business. Thank you so much, guys.